So my name is Sarah. I am a student lawyer, and for 6 months I've been working in an association that is called the CCIF, Collectif Against Islamophobia in France. So this association aims at helping the victims of Islamophobia in France, and it helps that the legal department gives some legal advice to the victims. So, and I was a member of the legal department since 6 months. So maybe I can make a short recall of the principle of laïcité in France, so that you can have good comprehension of my speech. So in France we have the principle of laïcité. In fact, it is very easy. It's just that in France the state is neutral. That is to say that all the state employees they can't show any religious signs. They have to be neutral and not to show their religious beliefs. But for the other citizens and public service users, they can show that they can wear their religious signs in public space. So that is very simple, in fact. And when I was in my daily work as a lawyer in this association, I could notice that the people who discriminate the Muslims, and especially the women wearing hijab, they use repeatedly the same types of justifications. So we can make a kind of categorization of these types of justifications. And as a result, today, when you are a Muslim woman who wears a hijab, it can be very complicated to do the most banal act of daily life. The most common act of daily life can become a nightmare, in fact. For example, to find a job. It's more and more complicated if you wear the hijab, to accompany your child at school or during school trips, to go to the gym, so doing sport, and to have access to education, to health care, and even to go to the restaurant. I don't know if you have heard the scandals that we had in September when 2 women were evicted from a restaurant because of their hijab. So, in general, these people who discriminate women with a hijab, they justify themselves by security reasons, even if it isn't justified. For example, women who want to join sport clubs, they can wear their hijab or their turban, but the manager decides to ban it for security reasons. Another kind of justification is the values of republic. So it doesn't mean anything because it has no legal basis. It has absolutely no legal basis, but it is something that I can hear regularly to justify that kind of discrimination. And of course, another justification is the principle of laïcité, of secularism that I explained to you just before, but they don't know the content of the law, so they made a mistake, but they discriminate someone in the name of the principle of laïcité, whereas it is not applicable. For instance, I had a case recently, the first day of school in September, when the director of a school, a public school, refused a mother with a hijab because he invoked the law, the 2004 law, but that law was not applicable. He just didn't know the law. So he refused that woman to visit the school because of his misunderstanding of the law. I don't know if I am clear. Are you okay? Okay. And sometimes there are no reason. For example, the doctors. We have more and more doctors who ask the women to withdraw her veil, without any reason. So they say, "Good morning, madam, please sit down, but withdraw your veil," and that's all. No reasons, and of course it's illegal. Then, since the terrorist attacks that happened in France recently, we can notice a new kind of justification for these discriminations, and that is the dramatic context. The dramatic context. So in their narratives, the people who discriminate make the link between the veil and terrorism, extremism, and the trauma. So, and they ban the veil, the hijab, to protect the citizens from the remembrance of that trauma. So it's a kind of pure psychological reason. So I will give you many examples. So here you can read an email that I have received from a director of a business school who refused a student because of her hijab, and he justifies himself by the dramatic context. So he said the dramatic events that have affected our country heated the minds of some students who may feel hurt or even uncomfortable in the presence of people openly showing their religious beliefs. And just after, there is another instance of the director of a pharmacy who decided suddenly he asked her employee to withdraw her hijab when she was coming back from holidays, because, once again, of the context. So he said, I reiterate to you that given the latest dramatic events in France, I asked everyone to be neutral at the pharmacy, as in all public establishments. So he makes a confusion between everything. And then, for instance, so we have that kind of cases. Women come back from holidays and suddenly the boss changes their mind because of the terrorist attacks. What is worrying, what is really frightening for our country, is that even the judge recently, this summer, when there was polemics around the burkini, even the judge in Nice validated the bans of burkini, but not on legal basis, but on that kind of psychological basis. So here you have an extract of the decision of that judge, and he justifies the ban on that kind of subjective elements by considering the other swimmers' sensitivity and considering their feelings and not the law. Especially, I beg your attention on that when you say in this context, wearing clothing on the beaches could be prejudicial to the beliefs or lack of beliefs or other users on the beach. So he wants to preserve the atheists the atheists, and the people who have different religion. So in fact, to make it short, he validated an illegal decision just to not disturb people who don't like religious signs. Going over all these discourses, we can question the direct influence of some politicians' narratives on that behaviors. I don't know if you have heard of our former Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, who was a former Prime Minister, and is famous for his Islamophobic declarations. And for example, he said, denouncing the burkini, it is in no case to question an individual freedom. There is no freedom that locks up women. It is denouncing and mortifying Islamism retrograde. So he absolutely hates the burkini and the veil, and he also said, he spoke about Marianne, the symbol of France, the lady, and he said, Marianne has a breast naked because she feeds the people. She's not veiled because she's free. That's a republic. So that kind of discourse of narrative can probably feed the conflation between the veil and terrorism and extremism. There is also another famous declaration from our Minister of Women's Rights. She's called Laurence Rossignol, and she is a Minister of Women's Rights, but she said that she compared women that chose to wear the hijab with American Negroes that supported slavery. So that was also a declaration that was absolutely incredible. So that kind of discourse from politicians, from people that are at the head of the state, can absolutely influence the citizens and incite them to liberate their Islamophobia and encourage them to discriminate the women with the hijab. I can't say today that there is a strict correlation between these narratives and the citizens that discriminate women. I can't say that today because we need more analysis and deep investigation. That's why I can call you to action, you as researchers, to make deep analysis of that phenomena. But I had recently the case of a doctor who denounced a woman with hijab to the police. So he saw her in his consultation room, and then he denounced her to the police, and so he had then trouble with the Council of Doctors. And in his letter to the Doctors' Council, he justified himself by referring to the discourse of the Prime Minister and the President relatively to the state of emergency and the state of war. So really there is a question, do this discourse, Islamophobic discourse from the top of the state, influence citizens and are they license to discriminate? Thank you.
So our next speaker is Imam OMAR SULEIMAN from YAQEEN Institute. It's a newly formed institute in the United States, and as a matter of declaration, I'm one of the advisors on the advisory, but I have no vested interest in the writing of the paper, so nobody can claim that I have done anything. So please, if you could welcome OMAR SULEIMAN.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. I actually left my paper on my MacBook over there because I realized if I started reading from it, then this would take about 45 minutes. So I'll wait for any specific questions about any specific statistics or findings for the Q&A part of this so that I can stick to the time that's been allotted. My topic is on internalized Islamophobia, exploring the faith and identity crisis of American Muslim youth. Why and who are we experimenting on, or why is this research so important? It was interesting because in one of the previous panels, you know, the notion, which is a very true one it seems, was brought up that there have been numerous studies on British Muslim minorities, on different European Muslim minorities, but very few actually on the American Muslim minority, the psychological impact of Islamophobia on American Muslims as a minority. So with the rise of Islamophobia, Islam has been cast as irrational, incompatible with modern civilization, and inherently violent. This has put Western Muslims in a defensive position in which they constantly have to justify their convictions and fight off the doubts and insecurities that arise in such a climate. Now, there are already enough teenage problems that teenagers will have, but Muslim teenage problems are highly compounded because of this dangerously high cognitive dissonance that they have, and they have to hyper-counter all of the assumptions that are made about them, which makes their teenage problems even greater than other teenage problems, right? So it's not just the identity crisis that naturally occurs at that age when you're talking about people between the age of 16 and 20 or in adolescence, but it's all of the implications of being a Muslim, particularly an identifiable Muslim in public. The insecurities in identity and the crisis of faith that arises out of that, which I would argue is virtually not studied at all, or has not actually been presented in many journals at all, which is the faith crisis that naturally occurs as a result of the climate of Islamophobia. So what I did was I actually conducted in-depth interviews with 30 young American Muslims, 19 girls and 11 boys. 15 of the girls reported wearing hijab regularly. All of them were born citizens, 24 of them the children of immigrants, most of whom were eventually naturalized. And they were between the ages of 16 and 30. All of them live in the United States, and I tried to have different, you know, some youth that go to Islamic schools, some that go to private schools that aren't Islamic schools, and some that go to public schools as well. Now, one of the models that was brought up in 2012, one of the earlier models studying Muslim identity as minorities, was in the 2012 journal, which tried to draw the parallels between, or the links between religious identity, national identity, private national engagement, perceived Islamophobia, experienced negative representations in media, discrimination, and public national engagement, and studying all of those links separately, which I think is a very important model, because one thing that can be inferred for sure is that these are, you know, that each one of these boxes does have an impact on the other. The degree of that impact is what's debatable, right? Because a lot of times these studies, in trying to derive a certain conclusion, will ignore other factors that can impact these things. But one of the things that numerous studies have found, obviously, is that a stronger religious identity is directly linked with a stronger national identity, directly linked with greater civic engagement. There was a famous ISPU poll last year, or a study on American Muslims in the year 2015, which linked frequent mosque attendance with likeliness to vote, likeliness to participate, feeling stronger about one's American identity at the same time. So studying those links is very important, but usually those studies tend to the impact on national identity more so than the religious identity. So in that cognitive dissonance, one thing that you can find is that many Muslims feel like they have to hide their Islamic part depending on the environment they're in, or they have to hide their American part depending on what environment they're in. But usually the way that the studies go is they go towards the national identity, and then, you know, more often than not are linked to radicalization because this person is feeling marginalized, and so on. So when we study internalized Islamophobia, one thing that's important to look at are studies on internalized racism as a whole. The very famous Black Doll study of 1947, where young black children were likely to associate more positive things with white dolls, and, you know, things like beauty and benevolence with white dolls rather than black dolls. And there is a recent study that actually came out while I was already in the process of writing this, out of San Francisco State University that was published, at least the initial study was published, which studies Muslim children using the same types of measures. So, in this study, they had Muslim children draw out, for example, portrayals of Muslim women, Muslim men, and found, very similar results in terms of the things that young children, I believe I'll have to look at it, but I believe it was children between the age of 3 and 7, associated, backwardness and ugliness and regression with Muslim objects and with Muslim people. But what happens is that as people go on and as our children grow, naturally that identity confusion is compounded. Charles Parrish, who's a scholar on internalized racism, he noted how young black children move on from black and white to over 145 different labels of blackness by the time they hit junior high, right? How black you are. So different measures of blackness tend to start to arise once they start hitting junior high. And in many cases, the things that would determine success or the things that would determine a person's value in society as a whole have been internalized even within the African American community toward to where the blacker you are, the less popular you would be, and you would be bullied even within an African American setting at times. So that compounded identity confusion, as it exists with young African American children, it also exists with young Muslims. As young Muslims grow, and one of the most fascinating responses I got in my interviews was with a young hijabi girl that was telling me about the way she has to wear her hijab depending on the place she's at, because she wants to send a particular message to the aunties in the mosque, that she's Islamic enough, right? But she also wants to send a message to her young Muslim peers that she's cool enough, and she wants to send a message to her American peers that she's not really that Muslim, but she's doing what she has to do because of what her parents have forced upon her. So these trends, just as they go from 2 to 145 when talking about blackness, they go from 2 to like 300 when talking about Muslimness and what determines your religiosity. So especially when you talk about the vertex of hijab fashion, Muslim women fashion, what each and every single trend represents about a person and the messaging that's sought through all of that. One of the things that we see with Muslim youth in particular in living as minorities is that their identity is racialized. So even a black young Muslim girl, African American young Muslim girl, Caucasian American young Muslim girl will have her identity racialized. And so trying to counter that, the assumptions that people make of you because you're a young Pakistani hijabi, or you're an African American girl who's wearing hijab, trying to counter all of that, all of the assumptions that come with that, lead these youth into very dangerous places in regards to their own self-esteem and in regards to the resentment that they feel towards the religion itself and to the Muslim community, and to whatever pressures they feel, whether they're real or imagined, that put them in the situation that they are in. Now, with young Muslim women in particular, according to an initiative of the British government that deals with anti-Muslim incidents, 58% of Islamophobic attacks took place between April 2012 and April 2013. Almost 60% of them targeted Muslim women, of whom 80% were wearing hijab. So this is not an imagined, pressure. When you're talking about young Muslim women in particular that wear hijab in Islamophobic climates, they are more likely to be targeted, and we often negate the impact of low-level harassment, things that don't go reported. But what's it like for a 13-year-old girl or a 14-year-old girl to have some of the things screamed at them that we've spoken about here? How will they try to counter that, and how will they try to renegotiate their identities so that that incident does not happen once again? Now, what types of notions are being internalized? This is actually from Gallup. As it's, someone just mentioned the billboard, I think it was Nadia mentioned the billboard about about ISIS sucks and it's really a message to the public as opposed to the Muslim community. Obviously, what we see in regards to our countering Islamophobic rhetoric publicly is this need to distance ourselves from violence. But internally, a Muslim is more likely to accept the idea that Islam oppresses women than Islam is a violent religion. So externally, we have to fight off this notion that we're not violent, we're not extremists, that our religion is not more violent than any other religion, that Muslims are not more prone to violence than any other religious group. But internally, what are Muslim youth more likely to internalize? Are they more likely to internalize the notion that Islam is violent, or are they more likely to internalize the notion that Islam is inherently unfair towards women? That's something that's true within the public as well. So this is from Gallup in studying just American attitudes towards Islam and towards Muslims. So do you agree or disagree with each of the following statements about Muslims? Most Muslims around the world are accepting of homosexuals, and keep in mind this predates Pulse in Orlando. All right, only 8% of Americans thought yes, 78% of them disagreed. Now, people abandoning religion because they see religion as marginalizing is not just true within the Muslim community, it's true within the Christian community as well. But then look at the question on women. Believe that women and men should have equal rights. More Americans were likely to disagree with that, 81%, than the idea that Muslims are accepting of homosexuals. Now, when you talk about 81% of Americans believing that Muslim women are oppressed, that Islam is unfair towards women, obviously due to many of the images that are present in the media, always portraying Muslim women as very passive and oppressed. I think it's over 70% of portrayals of Muslim women in the media are passive and oppressed. Then we also have to expect that that's going to be internalized by young Muslim women, especially if they are facing pressures for being young Muslim women, right? So to adopt that. How much time do I have, Dr. Hudson? 5 minutes, okay, good. Now, reinforcement via personal experience. Abusive parents. Now, this is the pastoral side of me as opposed to the research side. People often will project their relationships with their closest relatives on their relationship with God. So this is, if I have an abusive relationship with people closest to me, then I'm likely to view God in a similar way, right? So when I have a personal experience, and I have abusive parents, for example, especially if they're immigrants, then I'm likely to believe more of the notions about my faith and about my faith identity due to that own, abusive context. And that's something that I did find with my own respondents. Restrictive cultures. If I find that my culture is holding me back. Now keep in mind, I was born and raised in the States. I'm sure many people here were born as Muslim minorities or born to immigrant parents. We have a very hard time distinguishing what's culture, what's religion, what's personal when coming from our parents. And it's, if it's negative, then we often can project it on the religion. So restrictive cultures can lead to a person, feeling that the religion itself is restrictive or their faith identity is restricted. Community spaces. This is probably the biggest one. Okay. Only 3 of the 30 youth that I actually interviewed felt like the masjid was welcoming, that the mosque was welcoming to them. That did not include any of the female respondents. Okay, so if I'm being told in the media that that Muslim culture, that Islamic culture is repressive, that there's no gender justice, that I'm going to a mosque and I'm in a basement, or I'm being treated in a certain way in my own masjid, then I'm likely to inherit all of that baggage and all of those assumptions myself. And so that's definitely one of the, if not the greatest dilemma that we have, and it's very much so present in the discourse in regards to why people are unmosqued, why people are unchurched, why people are unsynagogued, right? But why people are unmosqued, often the unacceptable space for Muslim women, which is of course cultural, not religious, but the insufficient space is likely to play a role in developing that notion. Now, all 3 of those youth that said that they did feel like the masjid, the mosque was welcoming, they all said 2 things. They used the word support, So they felt like their mosques were supportive of their struggles, acknowledged their struggles. So I have an interview, for example, with a 17-year-old girl after San Bernardino that was thinking about taking off her hijab, but she said that she heard a sermon from the imam, and the imam was praising her and encouraging her and supporting her and admiring her struggle, and she felt like she was spiritually enabled, that she had more spiritual fuel to be able to take on that struggle. So the word support came up in all three of those interviews, and all of them also mentioned that they'd be comfortable bringing their non-Muslim friends to the mosque, right? So it goes back to perception, and am I betraying my Americanness? Am I betraying my Islamic identity? One of the issues that we have as well, obviously, are historical events. References to certain historical events and battles in the early history of Islam figure into these associations, and simple reassurances that Islam means peace, which was also mentioned in the last panel, do little to curb the resultant doubts. It doesn't work when we come back with those one-liners, especially when you have, extremist groups and then Islamophobic sensationalizing media that's putting forth certain things about your religion, about the history of the religion, that would not have come out in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Like, I could not imagine Rudy Giuliani after 9/11 shouting on Fox News, claiming that Muhammad killed the Jews, right? And actually trying to pronounce Bani Qurayza, or trying to pronounce actual seerah incidents from the prophetic biography to justify an Islamophobic claim. So the advancement of Islamophobia, and in referencing historical events and referencing things that could be problematic in our faith tradition, in the history of Islam, and them having the ability, Islamophobes having the ability to craft that narrative before authentic Muslim scholarship can actually, give a mature understanding of those problematic texts, immediately puts them in a very uncomfortable position. So even though right-wing Islamophobia really is not aimed at making a person renounce their faith or renounce their faith identity, it's aimed obviously amongst many things in bringing about discriminatory legislation, but still the impact could be that it becomes so uncomfortable. One of the respondents used the words mental anguish. It becomes so uncomfortable to be identifiably Muslim in public that I just want to, I look at those things and I say, that is Islam, I want nothing to do with it. Or obviously in the case of radicalization, that is Islam, how come no one else is talking about this? So that is the only authentic portrayal of Islam. And so slavery and brutality and these groups are either the only representation of Islam, right, and all other leadership is inauthentic, or the resolve becomes that my religion, that I've been lied to, my faith identity, all of that is a big lie, and why am I even struggling in the first place? So one of the problems that we have, counseling and the mental anguish of young Muslims, the therapeutic alliance is considered to be one of the most important aspects of successful psychotherapy, and has been found to be a consistent predictor of treatment outcomes in over 30 years of research. Non-Muslim counselors may be influenced by media projections of Islam and then falsely portray those notions on vulnerable youth. So and this is one of the things that often happens, particularly when it comes to the hijab, or when it comes to a young Muslim girl that's struggling or being bullied. As one study said, if a non-Muslim female psychologist assumes that a hijab is oppressive against women, she may unconsciously try to steer her client away from covering instead of understanding the significance of the hijab in her Muslim client's life. Now, when young people are vulnerable, in that state of vulnerability, they would be more prone to those types of explanations and that type of therapy. Now, very interestingly enough, I had 6 of the 30 respondents tell me they'd been to therapy because of bullying, or because they were having a hard time with their identity. 4 of them said they went to non-Muslims. Why did they go to non-Muslims? Because they were afraid of being stigmatized by the Muslim community if the Muslim community found out that they went to a therapist. The response in the Muslim community to the lack of mental health resources is often, we need more Muslim mental health counselors and more therapists, but the fact of the matter is that it's just like the Islamic school solution, right? Like, we just need to have more Islamic schools. Well, over 90% of your population is still not going to go to Islamic schools, so that's not going to solve the problem. You still have to deal with those uncomfortable spaces. So this internalized Islamophobia is not just a predicament with the Muslim youth themselves, but often with the counselors and with the therapists. And all four of those that went to non-Muslims as therapists mentioned that they did sense that feeling that they were being swayed away from their faith, that their counselors immediately went to a place of, it must be your Islamic culture, your Muslim background that's putting you down. And then the two that went to Muslim counselors, one of them said that confidentiality was broken, which is a fear that many young Muslims have, in particular when they go to a Muslim counselor. Is confidentiality going to be maintained? Is it going to spill over to the community? And so again, these reinforced notions will take place. And then lastly, Islam empowerment or impediment. What does my faith do for me? Do I have to give it up to get to certain places? Now, this is something that is very deeply instilled within the young Muslim psyche when they live in these climates, that I have to forsake my religious identity in order to ascend, in order to climb the ladder in some way, right? I've got to give it up. If I don't renegotiate my identity towards less Islamic, then I'm not going to be accepted in these spaces, and my career will suffer and my aspirations will suffer as a result. Insecurity equals idleness. So the Khizr Khan narrative, for example, does little to give a young Muslim a role model. That this is something I can aspire to and I want to be that person. A Hakim al-Ajwan or a Hussein Abdullah, who's a professional football player, that does, right? Or someone that I once had a young Muslim ask me, where is our Muslim Mother Teresa? Philanthropists, people that have ascended, people that have done great things, that have gone on not despite their Islamic identity, but because of their Islamic identity. The greatest example is Muhammad Ali, someone that would constantly reference his identity and his faith as a source of strength and as a vehicle for his contribution, right? So the lack of that is very dangerous because they don't have those positive role models often. So it's important to create volunteerism and contribution through an Islamic framework. And this was one of the positive quotes, was from Zainab, who's 17. She said she wasn't proud of her hijab until she wore it when she was 14 at a Serve the Homeless event. And someone came up to me and said, I always see your people around here passing out food. So that positive association with her identity, with contribution, was very important to her. So the importance of bringing people from a state of conviction and security, a sense of security with their identity, and then also channeling that sense of security and conviction into a place of contribution. Thank you.
Next, our presenters, Richard Michael Wilson, University of Exeter, and Priya SARA Matthews. Is this from SANT'ANNA School of PISA?
Yeah.
So please take us to the next presentation.
Hi, so I'm Priya. I'm from School of Advanced Studies in SANT'ANNA, PISA, and that's Richard. And our topic is tracking the perpetuation of patterns of repression within the counter-terror legislation. We're looking at UK and France, so I'll start off and I will look at France, and then Richard will look at UK. In this paper, we will explore the way in which the state has utilized identity and racial politics as a means of wielding power and limiting dissent within the context of post-9/11 paradigm of secularization and the expansion of counter-terrorism measures in UK and in France. It will offer explanations of the way in which this power of racial delineation is developed and utilized through mutually reinforcing system between coercive hard force on the one hand, and unconsenting violent discourse within the context of government and media on the other hand. The co-optation of identity politics. Identity politics has become a topic of study in social sciences and political sciences in fairly recently, so mainly with in the 1960s with the various civil movements, whether it was the women's rights movement or the black rights movement. So it is at this moment that different people started to focus on their personal identity as a reason for more rights, or as a differentiation from the majority. However, the use of identity in power balances has always been used It was one of the main instruments for wielding power and limiting dissent, especially during the colonial times. The empire, specifically the British Empire, but in certain cases also the French Empire, were very famously used the divide and rule strategy. And the main idea behind the divide and rule was there were 4 devices to create this strategy. The first one was creation of differences. The second one, augmenting of existing differences. The third was channeling or exploitation of the differences to the power's advantage. And the fourth one was politicization of these differences. And this strategy ensured that the people of the colonized nations were more focused to fight amongst themselves rather than the colonizers. It was a tactic so efficient that many such divisions are still strongly felt in former colonies. And I think the most obvious example would be India, Pakistan today, and the fact that they're still more focused on fighting each other when there could be bigger issues solved together. The conceptualization of race and religion are the 2 aspects of identity that has been constantly used as a politicized weapon in modern history. This can be seen, for example, in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where it has been painted very often as a civil war between the Catholics and Protestants, when one of the fundamental reasons were it was due to the British colonization, and it was more a struggle between the colonized and the colonizers. Also can be seen with the racial tensions in the United States that often depicted as simply being about the result of slavery, but it does not focus on the systemic and institutionalized disadvantages faced by the African American communities. In both of these cases, one section of the population was habitually disadvantaged in terms of access to many of the rights available to them, in particular with relation to employment and education. And thus this ensures that the status quo remains unchallenged. As such, this process implies a state-led and state-centric framing response that helps in the exertion of power over particular kinds of activism under expanding process of secularization. For the purpose of this talk, we take the definition of securitization as the process by which an issue or a group comes to be defined as a security threat so that the governmental and societal resources can be mobilized to counter it. This process has resulted in the development of 2 mutually reinforcing tactics: the use of military and other security forces in the projection of force in response to certain forms in the activism, in their immediate subjugation of dissent, and the formation of supporting discourse which normalizes and legitimizes violence as a part of problem-solving approach. The latest in this line of power-serving method is the so-called war on terror and fight against terrorism. With the attacks of New York in 2001 and the subsequent war on terror, the new terrorism paradigm has become a constant discourse and results in power projecting by synonyms, making Islamic terrorism to be synonyms with terrorism in general. So it's, anything regarding Islamic formations have become a contention with politics to expanding governmental power in traditional civil fields of society, which often encroach upon and restrict individual rules. What's interesting about the word Islamophobia is, even though it's many times cited that the first use in political terms has been with the Runnymede Trust report in 1997 with Islamophobia, threat to us all. I found that the first noticed instant of the appearance of the word Islamophobia was in 1910 by French civil servants, and it was used in the context of the Algerian colonies, and it was used ethnological report and to the French government and advising them not to use either Islamophobic nor Islamophilic approaches when dealing with the colonies, as it would create contention between the different population in Algeria. So looking at Islamophobia from a colonial perspective is not bringing something new, but continuing something that already existed. So in looking at the French context, as always within the divide and rule policy and the 4 points that I mentioned before, in France, the post-colonial approach to immigrants was through assimilation, where the French immigrants had to assume a French identity. So in a way, they were asked to sort of leave out a part of their identity, because you're not French Algerian, you're just French, well, ideally speaking. So the focus was on secularism or laïcité, as my former speaker just mentioned. So Islamophobia could be understood as a coupling of laïcité, which basically translates to secularism. It was historically put into place to create a separation between the Catholic Church and the state, but has now been used often wrongly as meaning just secularism, and is used as an offense, or rather a defense against any symbols of religion. And this process enables the othering of those that challenge the notions of French republicanism, with the internalization of ethno-racial inequalities in line with the French colonial experience. This is support the French securitization process within the post-9/11 paradigm, particularly intensified with respect to migration and the refugee crisis in recent years. Particular examples of Islamophobia include the headscarf affair, which in a secondary school in Creil, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, 3 Muslim girls of North African origin were asked to remove their veils that were covering their hair, and on refusing to remove them, the 3 girls were suspended and then eventually expelled. So this started the national debate around the headscarf in France, and then eventually led to the law which banned the headscarves from schools and high schools and several other public spaces, thus limiting the places where French Muslim women were able to freely access. The augmentation of differences. The September 11 attacks were already used by French media as a way like in many parts of the Western world, to reinforce this othering and this clash of civilization discourse. This was further highlighted by the Danish cartoon controversy in 2006. And then in the recent years, especially 2015 and 2016, with attacks in France, including Charlie Hebdo, the Bataclan, and the associated attacks in Paris, and the Bastille Day attack in Nice, French securitization processes have expanded as well. In just 3 months, the first 3 months after Charlie Hebdo attack, there were several anti-Muslim and Islamophobic attacks, and there was a lot of spread of counter-terrorism measures, which was a direct response to these attacks. The state of France declared a state of emergency, which initially was supposed to be for 12 days, which then extended, and at the last announcement it was extended to January 2017. And the former Prime Minister Valls had declared that it could probably be in place till there was the end of Daesh. This state of emergency gives the Interior Minister and the police force indiscriminate amount of power. The law itself cannot be considered as a threat. However, the definition of what constitutes a threat is very vague. it has, with using this state of emergency, they have anyone who is considered a threat could be put in house arrest. And there have been at least 350 to 400 people who are been in this case. Furthermore, the law enforcement of the raids has led to the raid of at least 3,200 houses, places of worship, and restaurants of minorities. Most of these properties, and in many places, most of these properties had severe damages, as the police would enter very violently and cause damage to the property, and also led to severe psychological trauma to the people. Because in a lot of cases, it would then discover that the allegations were wrong, but once it has already happened, there's very little you can do to undo what happened before. The house arrests have led many to be unable to go for work and thus losing their job, therefore disadvantaging and already disadvantaged people even more. Unemployment among the French Muslim undergraduates is 26%. In the summer of 2006, as was earlier mentioned, there was also the banning of the burkini, which is a full-body swimsuit worn by which some Muslim women wore to the beach. This ban was not upheld by the Supreme Court. However, while it was enforced, it infringed on French Muslims' freedom of expression, and thus was was also a cause of humiliation and distress. It's not only this state of emergency however, does not affect only French Muslims. It also has an effect on French citizens in general. One of the cases was in 27th of September 2016. A lecturer and researcher from the University of Sorbonne experienced violence in the hands of the police because he filmed what he felt was aggressive behavior by the police on a black woman. And as he questioned, and because of his actions, the police was then violent towards him, as they felt that they felt empowered to do so. Exploitation of power imbalances. The French state has engaged in a particularly aggressive and systematic targeting of Islamic identity markers, which has targeted immigration, citizenship, and attire. The construction of French citizenship has itself become politicized, with continued discussion of the stripping of citizenship of those considered a threat, thus causing a fear in the immigrant population and creating or rather emphasizing what they already suspected, that they are not equal to other French citizens. The problematization of Muslim communities occurs in a way which is particular to the French experience of colonialism, in which ethno-racial lines have been internalized in France with the rise of significant yet structurally disadvantaged Muslim minority. This has reflected a current political language. For instance, Eric Zemmour's proposal for the deportation of 5 million Muslims in 2014. Now I'll give it over to Richard for the UK aspect.
Thank you very much. What Priya has started to look at from the French context, and which I will now put into the UK very quickly.
Like the British Parliament.
Yes, exactly. Is that actually the process of divide and rule, which has been looked at within a very colonial context, can be looked at within current post-colonial practices or post-colonial contexts in understanding the securitization processes that are going on within current Western countries. And I'll quickly kind of take you through, again, it's Morrick's 4-step definition of the creation of division, the augmentation of this difference, the exploitation of power differences, and ultimately the politicization of these differences, along with the depoliticization of a counter-terrorism response that very much fits in within the divide and rule strategy. So firstly, the creation of division within the UK particularly has come about within a 9/11 context, primarily through problematizing certain formations of Islamic identity, and these are very specific within the UK context as differentiated from the French context. This has been seen in kind of very hard policies within counterterrorism, which include sort of the appallingly named Muslim Contact Unit within the Metropolitan Police, the overrepresentation, as we've already seen, of Arab Muslims within police stop and searches, as well as sort of Al Capone-style tactics, which subvert usual legal practices against Islamic activists, even though they're engaging in perfectly legal activism. This focus on ideology has been crystallised within the British context with the development of the PREVENT strategy, and particularly recently, we've briefly had work on the PREVENT strategy in previous discussions by Samira. The PREVENT strategy has really come to the fore as part of contest, as part of the wider counter-terrorist strategy, and seen as a way of, as we've seen, like preventing counter-terrorism from happening. But of course what this does is it focuses very, very much on a form of identity and ideology as being not just a motivation, but as the prime motivation behind terrorist incidences. What this does ultimately is this augments a difference between a good Muslim and a bad Muslim, and good forms of Muslim activism and bad forms of Muslim activism. The good Muslim demonstrates support for British values, is willing to integrate, and is held to much higher standards than the mainstream population. Meanwhile, the bad Muslim is representative of Giddens Mazer's bad radical, who challenges certain discursive red lines, such as contemporary forms of democracy or the state, within a highly racialised environment. What is understood to be a bad radical is, of course, incredibly complex and almost ridiculous, because it's an idea that is incredibly hard to understand, falls within conceptualizations of extremism. But one point I would like to move on to very quickly is that this idea, we have to get behind what's holding up this idea. And one thing that has to be looked at is a lot of the think tanks, the government organisations that are helping to support such conceptualisation, and the interests that these organisations have. So for instance, to name a few, from the Rose Gallery, organisations such as the Quilliam Foundation, the Centre of Religion and Geopolitics of the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, the Henry Jackson Society, Student Rights, all sort of helping to buttress this idea of ideology as being very problematic. And it's these groups that we really have to critique and understand the power structures and the money and the government influence that is behind these conceptualizations of ideology as a problem. Ultimately, this creates this leads to a concept of Muslims being a fifth column, or certainly aspects within the Islamic community being seen as a fifth column, and leads to both a politicization of Muslim identity markers, as has been discussed, but also a depoliticization of the response towards them. So ultimately, when issues are flagged of people within current discourse now, it's moving on to a vulnerability. People are now vulnerable to radicalisation within the British counter-terror policy, and that's something that's really come around in the last 2-3 years or so. And what this concept of vulnerabilisation does is it depoliticises the response. So if someone is vulnerable to radicalisation, it's not that they have legitimate political grievances, it's not that they have political issues that need to be responded to, or problems that need to be explored. It's rather that they're sort of seen as a technical problem, a non-political problem. They're stripped of a political voice. And the response, therefore, is a response sort of devoid of any content other than security and protection, in the same way that you would respond to, say, someone who's flagging up an issue of child abuse or of crime or of drug taking, which is very problematic within a context where lots of these issues should be refocused within a political context. So just to round this up into two conclusions. Firstly, the approach results in a number of methodological implications for current and future research of Islamophobia. Firstly, the use of the conceptualizations of identity politics as a framing device has to be expanded to show how it's been co-opted by the state through a sort of post-colonial divide and rule approach. Secondly, researchers need to approach Islamophobia within this context as an inherent part of the securitization process, and led, above all, most importantly, by those who have greater means and greater interests in shaping the debate within the centre of society. As such, I would contest that Islamophobia must be understood not as a subversion of the state, but as an inherent part of its continued power projection. Thank you very much.
So now, our last speaker for this evening is YASSER LOUATI, human rights activist, and works on issues of Islamophobia, presented in a number of places, including in Sarajevo and Istanbul, and joined us also in France last year as well. So please, Yasser.
Hi, so my name is Yasser. My name is Yasser Louati. I'm a French human rights and civil liberties activist. My areas of focus are actually Islamophobia and national security. Well, I began with Islamophobia, but I had no choice but to extend my area of research, because to sell an agenda of a police state, to make it acceptable, you will need to go through various steps, as mentioned in the old divide and conquer strategy. My paper today is about Islam, the left, and the permanent state of emergency. As all of you know, we have been now living under a state of emergency for over a year. The effects against terrorism have been almost close to zero. Nevertheless, it has been continuously extended in order to pass a series of measures, and we will see the road to becoming what I call the laboratory of Islamophobia. Please take a look at this slide. These are the 24 measures I have been able to count since 1987 to target French citizens belonging to the Muslim faith. It began in 1987 with the Marceau Commission, and it was actually set up because back then they were already questioning, can Muslims be French citizens? The old idea was that the first and second generation of immigrant workers would come to work and leave. Right? Then they were like, you know what? Bring in your wives so you can have babies here, because your kids will take over and work in factories and construction sites. Well, too bad the economy collapsed, and then everybody settled. So when Muslims began becoming visible, there was a shock, because the second generation, the ones we call the first ones to be born in France, who were let's say teenagers in the 1980s, they said, well, this is my country. I no longer have to live like my parents, bowing my head and acting like a guest. This is my country, and I demand full respect and full citizenship. In 1983, for example, we had the so-called March for Equality and Dignity, after a series of bloody summers, during which Arab citizens were killed by the police. For example, in 1973, 12 people got killed by the police and nobody was sued or prosecuted. So it begins in 1987 and all the way down to 2016. And we can see the various measures. They range from laws, they go to reports on the new laïcité. It's in 2003, you can see it over there, for a new laïcité, questioning the concept of laïcité, turning it from a constitutional principle of separation between the church and the state, and then making it an ideological tool to justify the exclusion of Muslims. Then we had, for example, the law of 2004 banning the headscarf, the banning of the full-face veil, the law against the veiled nannies, etc., etc. So all in all, that's 24 measures specifically targeting one community, the Muslim one. So the road to becoming the laboratory of Islamophobia didn't begin today or this year. It began a long time ago. Let's say the early 80s. Actually, I was supposed to put all the presidents since 1983, but I didn't have enough time. So my apologies. So we have François Mitterrand over there, then we had Jacques Chirac, Nicolas Sarkozy, François Hollande, and then who knows, François Fillon, Marine Le Pen, or Manuel Valls, who knows. That is working. So I have an example here of how the French public opinion was manipulated. Here you have the polls, on French public opinion regarding the banning of the headscarf in 2004. As you can see, in the beginning of the year 2003, it was about 47 and 49%. The public opinion was split. People weren't actually sure if they sided for or against it. And you can see the curves split clearly when the president of France, Jacques Chirac, speaks from Tunisia and says, well, we need to have a law to prohibit the headscarf. What needs to be said is that when Jacques Chirac spoke against the headscarf, we had the Stasi Commission, which was supposed to study the possibility whether or not we should pass the law and the study mechanism. So you have a commission going on, then you have the president telling you from overseas, we need a law. You can't go against the president's will, and you won't go against him after him taking a public stance. During that year, for example, we also had massive coverage on the Muslim headscarf. I think it was about 1,500 pieces of media production, articles, columns, video, documentaries, etc. I have the exact figures, but I'll find them. But during the same year, we had mass rallies against the reforming of the public pensions. So we have about 3 times more coverage regarding the headscarf than we had about people marching to save what was left of the welfare state. Keep that in mind, that Jacques Chirac was a right-wing president calling for the prohibition of the headscarf. But then we had different mechanisms in order to divert public opinion. Let's look at the example of 2009, global crisis, Lehman Brothers, etc., etc. What monopolized public opinion and public discourse and public debates was actually the debate on French identity, the so-called debate on national identity, which became a platform for the most racist rhetoric targeting Muslims. And the idea was that French identity can only be defined in opposition to French Muslims. It is no longer about French identity being inclusive of these new citizens, second, third, and fourth generation, but we only define ourselves in opposition to our fellow countrymen. In the end, this debate was cancelled because it was highly criticized. Every single time a platform was open in various cities, it became a platform for the most racist people to take the microphone and make it normal to direct hate speech at Muslims, especially Muslim women. Then we had a second, unpopular pension reform. This is, this young gentleman over there is Eric Woerth, who was the Minister of Finance, and he was proposing to again, dismantle the welfare state. What happened during that debate? We brought a new one, the debate on the full face bill. It's almost systematic. If you want to dismantle the welfare state, bring in some Muslim issue, all right, and let's put the spotlight on it and speak about it day in, day out. It worked in 2003, 2009, this time in 2010, with the parliamentary mission to study whether or not we should prohibit the full face veil. Just as the Stasi Commission, the Debré Commission on the headscarf, this one was again led by a white man telling women how to dress. How funny is that? And that law was passed because 367 women were wearing the headscarf, the full face veil. That's according to our domestic intelligence, DCRI. If we are able to pass a law specifically targeting less than 400 women, can't we pass some laws to target, I don't know, tax evasion, corruption? I don't know, maybe I'm dreaming, but this shows you the state willingness to continuously use Muslims as scapegoats while dismantling the welfare state and then pushing for new laws to crack down on civil liberties, just as the burkini was a clear example of white men telling women how to dress. So in 2015, 2016, this is what happens. Terrorist attacks in November, terrorist attacks in, an attack in the Bastille Day. To me, it's not a terrorist attack, but more a mass killing made by a psychopath. But the measures taken were all made to hold Muslims responsible. So far, 4,000 raids have been carried to only 6 inquiries. Try to calculate the ratio of that. You have been raiding hundreds of Muslim homes, shops, ransacking mosques, yet you are only able to come out with 6 inquiries. And every single body dealing with human rights agreed on the fact that Muslims were the first target of the state of emergency. French Human Rights League, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc. And to quote, for example, the chief of staff for the prefect of the Eure-et-Loir, a prefect is like a governor, who's the indirect authority of a specific region. We are mainly targeting people who are devout Muslims who change the way they dress. That's official. It's no longer about human rights activists saying maybe yes, maybe not. It is the case. But again, divide and conquer. When people remained silent for the targeting of Muslims, the state of emergency measures targeted those marching against the climate summit of last year. As a matter of fact, I had met with Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! Last year, and when we had the interview, she smelled like tear gas. And I was coughing when like, yeah, I'm sorry, Yasser. You know, the French police threw tear gas on us, and my clothes are still smell with it. So those measures of, for example, house arrests targeted Muslims in their homes because the neighbor denounced them, because the intelligence thought that if he's a practicing Muslim, that means he's somehow dangerous. Let's put him under house arrest. Nobody, and at best, people said this is wrong. Yeah, but those measures again targeted environmentalists, they targeted human rights activists, they targeted anarchists, they targeted leaders. And again, and that's why I call the term join the club. Because while you remained silent while Muslims were being targeted, it's your turn now. And that's why the old divide and conquer was not only used in the colonial era, but as Nasira Ghenif, another scholar on colonial issues, we are using colonial strategies within France, and the French people are themselves colonized by their own elites. Oh yeah, that was just, for example, in France, unemployment kills between 10,000 and 20,000 people. A significant portion of the French population can't afford to pay for health care, to show you the priorities being set by our government. 36% of single parents families live under the poverty line. This is France in 2016. 3.5 million people don't have decent housing. But the priority is always to maintain the public opinion in a state of permanent shock. Yes, I'm referring to Naomi Klein's shock theory. The French population has to be maintained in a state of fear, and then the elites come forward as, hey, we are going to make the day and save you from these people. Yeah, well, I was actually trying to make sure that you remember how the mass unemployment problem in France has not been dealt with the same rigor, with the same willingness as cracking down on civil liberties in France. And we will see later on that all these measures are completely ineffective against terrorism. Sorry, I was speaking about corruption. This is where France ranks, for example. Qatar, sorry. There we go. So that's why all these issues, which are deep issues in France, we can no longer say they are, marginal, that we can take care of them later on. This is where we rank even in terms of corruption, below other countries in Asia or in South America, yet nobody will take these measures seriously and deal with them instead of telling people, you need to give up on your individual liberties so we can tackle terrorists. All right. Something happened in April 2016. Prime Minister Valls was saying that yes, we have problems of, we have problems dealing with economics and unemployment, but what matters, what is essential, is the identity, the cultural battle. So that's why coming now to the Burkini hysteria of last summer, not only was it an opportunity for the media to have something to speak about in a low season like the month of August, but it was also a signal that the presidential election will be based on identity debates. And why there is a convergence between the right and the left is because all the candidates, from the far left to the far right, even the far right actually remained silent because to them everybody was doing the job. They all jumped on the bandwagon and spoke about the Burkini thing as if it were some kind of a problem. So that means as unemployment continues rising, as corruption is still threatening our social fabric, now the main thing that's going to hold public debates for the coming months is going to be identity debates. So what happened in the UK with the Brexit and the Trump election in the US will also happen here in France. But the situation is that France has not recovered from the financial crisis. We are still deeply affected by what happened 5 years ago. So while we are speaking about identity issues and turning French people against one another, all those problems will continue increasing until, in my humble opinion, the system collapses. And I'm quoting to you, for example, various politicians from the right and the left who admit the French Fifth Republic unsustainable. It is bound to collapse. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So let's speak about the good old thing that there is no media bias in the free world. That's an extract from the regular press coverage regarding Muslims. I begin from the 1980s until the late 2010s. And that's it. How can public opinion remain neutral? How can we say there is no state-sponsored Islamophobia when you have media like this? These are private weeklies, but they're also receiving subsidies from the state. That's a problem. So when you have the public service like French television inviting notorious Islamophobes like Éric Zemmour, who was condemned and convicted for hate speech after he called for the deportation of Muslims. Yet that person kept his job in a private radio station, RTL, but was also invited to promote his own book. And in that book, he was also targeting Muslims. So not only is the state silenced when public televisions invite notorious racists, but they're also providing millions of euros to, for example, Le Figaro, 16.2 million euros. And that's the #1 platform of Islamophobic mainstream media. So the question is there state-sponsored Islamophobia? You tell me. I guess it speaks for itself. So pensions, justice, homelessness, crisis, unemployment, purchasing power. Right? We need to argue. The problem is that Islamophobia is, how can I say, an existential threat for Muslims in France. If you're a Muslim woman in France wearing a headscarf, you have 1% chances of getting a job. We talked previously about Muslims being, in general, 4 times less likely of getting a job when they apply for one. Now, if you are wearing a headscarf, it's 1% chances. And when you add to it that laws have been passed to prohibit self-employed nannies working from home. I repeat, self-employed nannies working from home. There is a law prohibiting them from working. We call it the law on the veiled nannies. So even when they take the path of self-employment and entrepreneurship, they can't even make it. Now when you add to it debates on prohibiting or actually making private spaces in private companies religiously neutral, that means we are further pushing Muslims away from French society. But hate costs money, like everything in life. According to France Strategy, which is a think tank that depends on the Prime Minister's office, reducing discrimination would allow national GDP to increase by, no, the zero is indeed there, 150 billion euros. That's the cost of discrimination in France, on gender, on race, etc. But we shouldn't forget that, as I said earlier, there is a left and right consensus on Islamophobia. It is no longer a question of the far right being racist. That's the traditional platform. The problem is that what the far right has been preaching for the past 40 years now is being used by even left-wing governments. When you have, for example, under a left-wing government, the police being sent to chase women away from the beach because they are wearing a headscarf, that shows you how ridiculous it is. The problem is that those same policemen failed to stop a truck on the Nice, on the French Riviera, that drove for 1.8 miles. The guy drove nearly 2 miles and nobody stopped him. Yet we are capable of sending policemen on boats to tell Muslim women to get out of the beach. Under a left-wing government, that's a mosque being ransacked not by thugs, not by the far right, but by the police. And when you know that all mosques in France are already under tight surveillance, that all imams are known by the state, What was the point? Well, I have the answer. I spoke to one of the managers in the northern part of Paris. They met with the prefect. He answered, quote, "We need to send a message to the French population. That means you don't belong here. We are going to beat you to make others feel safer." No comment. Yes, one. There is one called David Thompson. He specializes on radicalization and terrorism. He said that this picture is going to feed the narrative of Daesh for the upcoming decades. No, for decades, sorry. That picture alone, 4 policemen, she could have been their mother. They surround her and ask her to take off her shirt. She wasn't even wearing a burkini. But as Said Bouamama, in English it would be Said Bouamama, yeah. He's notorious for working on questions of colonialism and African movements. The problem is that it wasn't only the police chasing that woman, it was people on the beach calling the police and telling them, "Go get that woman." That's how bad it got. But the state response to Islamophobia is, as usual, ludicrous. Racism is evil. That's all we get. We have existing laws that no tribunal wants to implement. We have notorious Islamophobes, acting on their own, and nobody is, dragging them to court. And the only thing the state can come up with is hashtag all united against hatred. And here they say it begins with words and it ends with, blood and fists in the face. No, Islamophobia begins with words and ends up in genocide. Ask Srebrenica what happened, and ask the Rohingyas what's happening to them. But also, again, the cost to democracy and the rule of law is just unacceptable. Patrice Calvar, who is the head of the domestic intelligence, called France in a country close to a state of civil war. Not because Muslims are evil, but because the far right is waiting for an opportunity to start targeting Muslims. And when you know, for example, that the far right and anti-terrorist groups have been sending people to Ukraine, first, we don't call them radicals. Nobody calls that radicalization. Same thing for French citizens joining the Israeli army. But those people, they go there, they get trained and come back. They learn to play with weapons, to kill. They come back here, nobody calls the police on them. Then we have the state of emergency, even if they lift it in the next coming months, and they will. All the exceptional measures of the state of emergency are now part of the regular law. So that means the day they lift it, it will only be a symbolic measure. That's what's going to happen when they lift it in the coming months. What happened is that we implemented in the meantime mass surveillance. We implemented the militarization of the police. When the police marched a few weeks ago, they not only violated the state of emergency, they marched with their faces covered. So the 2010 law, of course, only applies to Muslim women, doesn't apply to angry policemen. They marched with their weapons on them, and they managed to secure 250 million euros, and also the guarantee they would be able to carry their weapons off duty, and they would extend the scope of lethal usage of their weapons. That's how it works in France. In any democracy, they only respect the rapport de force. We also have, with the permanent demonization of Muslims and the diverting, what I call Islamo-diversion, you easily implement a neoliberal agenda. You dismantle the welfare state, implement repressive measures while people are talking about Muslims. Yesterday alone, a letter was sent by the executive branch of power to have the highest court in France, the Cassation Court, under supervision of the executive. No, those Muslims are very handy. So the enemy within, let's finish with this, was theorized in the 1940s by René Gontier towards Jews, the enemy within. They can't assimilate, they can't become French. So now the narrative is that there is no coming back from all that. We can't come back from all the measures they passed for the past year or even for the past 30 years. Now we also have strengthened the arbitrary measures of, for example, the white notes. White notes are just a piece of paper written by the intelligence Hatem Bazian is a dangerous Palestinian. That's it. Well, yeah, but the problem is that it's not even signed. There is no date. There's no place where it was written. It's just one officer can decide on your future by just writing a piece of paper. Not that gave grounds, legal grounds, to justify house arrest of hundreds of Muslims on mere suspicion. Balance of power, militarization of the police, and of course, greater involvements in wars abroad. That's not me saying it. People say I'm aggressive, maybe, but France can become a dictatorship within a week. That's not Yasser Louati speaking, that's the head of the Bar Association of Paris. Police union leader, you can't make that up. Given the different laws that were passed under the state of emergency, we are living under a totalitarian state, because all the powers have been taken by the executive branch of powers, and we no longer have strong checks and balances to make sure, in times of excesses, we can challenge the state. I might be philosophical, but there are reasons to worry about the future of France. First, because minorities are no longer protected, but because the various institutions of so-called French democracy are being threatened by its own elites. One quick parallel, and I want to remind it because I hear it quite often. When France's elites betrayed the country and collaborated with the Nazis, it was the Muslim indigenous soldiers fighting the Nazis to kick them out of here. And to have a country constantly demonizing its own children and holding them responsible for the attacks of foreign terrorist groups and being incapable of saying, us, we stand as one, there are really reasons to worry. Thank you very much.